She dropped a $50 bill at his feet like he was a beggar on the street. Not a word. Just a smirk, a manicured hand, and a piece of paper that said everything she thought of him. Ethan Walker didn't flinch, didn't blink. He picked up his toolbox, walked past her, and put his hand on that helicopter, like a doctor, touching a patient only he could save. 5 minutes later, the engine roared to life, and every single person in that hangar went completely silent. But what nobody knew yet was that fixing the helicopter was the easy part. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe. You're going to want to see how this ends. The call came in at 6:47 in the morning. Ethan Walker was already awake. He was always already awake. That was something the Air Force had drilled into him so deep it became biological. His eyes opened at 05:30 every single day, whether he wanted them to or not. By the time most of Phoenix was hitting snooze, Ethan had already made coffee packed. Mia's lunch, signed her permission slip for the school field trip, and was sitting at the small kitchen table, going through invoices he already knew weren't going to balance. The shop was 3 months behind on the lease. He hadn't told anyone that. Not his sister, not his buddy Ramos who helped him on weekends, not Mia. Especially not Mia. She was 9 years old, and she worried too much already had since her mother walked out 4 years ago. Mia had a habit of standing in doorways watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, those big brown eyes of hers doing calculations no 9-year-old should have to do. "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" She never said the words out loud. She didn't have to. So Ethan kept the invoices face down when she came into the kitchen. "Scrambled or fried?" he asked without looking up. "Scrambled," she said, climbing onto her stool at the counter. "With the cheese." "Always with the cheese." "The cheese is the whole point, Dad." He smiled at the table. Then he flipped the invoices over, pushed them to the corner, and started cracking eggs. That was their morning. That was their routine. 37 minutes of ordinary life before the school bus, before Ethan drove out to the shop on Route 9, before another day of trying to keep something alive that the world kept trying to kill. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Arizona area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. He'd been getting calls from creditors lately, and he wasn't in the mood to be polite to a collection agent at 6:47 in the morning. But something made him pick up. Old habit. In the Air Force, you always picked up. Walker Aviation and Repair. The voice on the other end was clipped professional, the kind of voice that was accustomed to people jumping when it spoke. "Is this Ethan Walker?" "It is. My name is Sonia. I am the executive assistant to Vera Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Aviation Technologies. Ms. Whitmore has a situation that requires immediate attention. I was given your name by—" "Who gave you my name?" A brief pause, like she wasn't used to being interrupted. "Colonel David Reyes. He said you were the best aircraft mechanic he'd ever worked with. Ms. Whitmore's private helicopter suffered an engine failure last night. We have 5 engineers on site who have been working through the night and haven't been able to identify the problem. Ms. Whitmore has an investor presentation at noon. She needs that helicopter airworthy by 10 a.m. Ethan glanced at the clock on the microwave. 6:49. 3 hours and 11 minutes. "What model?" he asked. "Sikorsky S-76D. He knew that machine the way he knew his own hands. He'd worked on 3 of them during his last deployment. Beautiful aircraft. Complicated. The kind of complicated that made bad mechanics throw parts at it, hoping something stuck, and good mechanics sit down and listen to it. "Send me the address," he said. "Mr. Walker." Sonia hesitated, and he could hear the awkwardness in it, like she was about to say something she'd been instructed to say but didn't personally enjoy saying. "Ms. Whitmore wanted me to communicate that this is a time-sensitive engagement. She typically works with certified aviation firms. This would be considered an unconventional arrangement. She's offering a flat consulting fee of—" "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Ethan said. "Send the address." He hung up before she could finish the sentence. "Who was that?" Mia asked from behind her scrambled eggs. "Work. Good work or stressful work?" He looked at her. 9 years old. those old eyes in that young face? Probably both, he said honestly. Eat your eggs. Yeah. He dropped her at the bus stop at 7:15, watched until the yellow doors folded shut behind her, and the bus pulled away, then drove back to the shop to grab his toolbox. Not the display case he kept at the front of the shop, that one looked professional. Everything organized and shiny, the kind of setup that reassured nervous clients. He grabbed the real one. The battered steel chest that had been with him since Bagram Airfield in 2009, that had been loaded and unloaded from transport vehicles across 3 continents, that had his name scratched into the lid in block letters by a man named Sergeant Kowalski, who said, "You mark your tools, Walker, or somebody walks off with your livelihood." The toolbox was heavy. The toolbox was ugly. The toolbox knew things. He threw it in the back of his truck and headed toward the Whitmore Aviation private hangar off the 101. He smelled money before he even pulled through the gate. That was the only way he knew to describe it, the particular quality of space and silence and polished surfaces that came with serious old comfortable money. The kind of money that hadn't been anxious in 3 generations. The hangar itself was massive climate-controlled, floored in epoxy-coated concrete that caught the light. 3 other aircraft sat along the far wall, a Citation jet, a smaller Robinson, and something under a canvas cover he couldn't immediately identify. The S-76D sat in the center of the space like a patient in an operating room surrounded by equipment and people. 5 of them in matching Navy coveralls with company logos. Engineers. The real kind, the expensive kind, the kind that came with tablets and laptops and diagnostic rigs that cost more than Ethan's entire shop. They were clustered around a monitor, talking in the low, exhausted tones of men who had been working all night and were starting to run out of ideas, but weren't willing to say so yet. Ethan parked his truck just inside the hangar entrance, got out, and pulled his toolbox from the bed. That's when he heard her. "You've got to be kidding me." He turned. Vera Whitmore was 34 years old, though she carried herself like someone who had decided age was a bureaucratic inconvenience she'd chosen to ignore. She was dressed like she was already at the investor meeting, charcoal blazer, silk blouse, heels on an epoxy floor, because she refused to let the ground dictate terms to her. She had the kind of face that magazines described as striking all strong angles and absolute confidence. And she was looking at Ethan's truck, at his toolbox, at his worn uniform, with Walker stitched over the left breast pocket, with an expression that belonged on someone who'd just found something unpleasant on the bottom of one of those very expensive heels. Behind her stood 4 other people, 2 in suits, 1 in a company polo, and a woman in safety gear who Ethan would later learn was Laura Mitchell, the site safety inspector. They were all watching. Some of them were already smiling in a way that wasn't kind. Vera walked toward him slowly, not rushed. She had the runway walk of someone who understood that rooms waited for her, not the other way around. She stopped about 6 feet away and looked him up and down once. It took maybe 3 seconds. The kind of assessment a person gives to something they've already decided the value of. "Who called you?" she said. "Your assistant, Sonia. She said you needed—" "I needed a mechanic, not—" She waved a hand at him, a gesture that encompassed everything, the truck, the toolbox, the uniform, all of it. "Whatever this is." "I'm a mechanic," Ethan said. "I can see what you are." She looked past him at the truck. There was a long scratch along the driver's side door that Mia had accidentally put there with her bicycle 2 summers ago, and a crack in the rear bumper from a fender bender in the Home Depot parking lot, and a strip of duct tape holding the passenger mirror at the right angle. Vera looked at all of it with the particular disdain of someone who had never had to use duct tape for anything in her life. "I specifically asked for an aviation-certified firm. What I got was—" "Reyes recommended me," Ethan said. "Colonel David Reyes. I know who David is. David also thinks military surplus parts are perfectly acceptable for commercial aircraft, so you'll forgive me if I take his recommendations with some caution." She turned back to look at him full in the face, and her voice dropped to something almost conversational, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. Look, I don't know what Sonia told you, and I apologize if she miscommunicated the nature of the situation. This isn't a truck engine. This isn't a lawnmower. This is a Sikorsky S-76D that requires FAA-certified specialists with current type ratings, and I have a current type rating on the S-76, Ethan said, and the S-92, and the UH-60, and 4 fixed-wing military platforms. I spent 11 years as an aircraft mechanic in the United States Air Force, Ms. Whitmore. I know what I'm looking at. Something shifted in her face. Not respect, not yet, maybe not ever, but something. A recalculation. She studied him for a moment like she was running numbers she hadn't expected to have to run. Then it passed. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and produced her wallet. Slim dark leather, the kind that held only cards and the occasional bill, because you only needed to carry cash when you were dealing with people who still used cash, and she drew out a $50 bill. She held it for just a moment, looking at it. Then she dropped it. Not handed it, not placed it. Dropped it. Right there on the epoxy floor between them, like she was tossing a bone to something that had wandered in from the street. Here, she said. Buy yourself breakfast. Go home. Let the professionals work. The laugh started at the back of the group. One of the suits. Then it spread the way these things do when people are performing for an audience and someone's already set the tone. The company polo guy turned away. One of the engineers at the monitor glanced over and smiled, then looked back at his screen. Ethan looked down at the bill on the floor. Then he looked up at the helicopter. He let the laughter run itself out. It took about 4 seconds. Then he walked forward, picked up his toolbox, and moved past Vera Whitmore toward the S-76. Hey! Her voice was sharp now, the pleasantness gone. I didn't say you could. You have a Sikorsky S-76D with an engine failure, he said without turning around. Your 5 engineers have been at it all night and haven't found the problem. You have a noon meeting you can't miss and a helicopter you can't fly. You can keep telling me to leave, or you can let me look at it. He set his toolbox down next to the aircraft and turned to face her. Your choice, Ms. Whitmore, but you should probably make it fast. It's almost 8 o'clock. The hangar was quiet. Vera stared at him. Her jaw was set, her eyes hard, and he could see her doing exactly what he'd said, running a calculation. Pride versus practicality. The desire to throw him out versus the reality of the clock on the wall. It was one of the engineers who broke first. Not loudly, almost under his breath, but in that big, quiet hangar it carried. Vera, let him look. We've got nothing. She didn't look at the engineer. She kept looking at Ethan. If you touch anything without my authorization. I won't touch anything without telling you first, Ethan said. I'm just going to listen to it. Listen to it. Yes, ma'am. Another moment. Then she made a small, sharp gesture with her hand, the kind of gesture that meant fine. But I'm watching you, and this means nothing, and turned and walked back toward her group. Ethan turned to the helicopter, and for the first time since he'd pulled into the hangar, he felt something unclench in his chest. He put his hand flat against the fuselage. This was the part he could never explain to people who hadn't done it. His ex-wife Michelle had asked him once early in their marriage what it actually felt like to work on aircraft. She'd expected him to talk about tools and technical manuals and checklists. Instead, he'd said something that made her look at him strangely for a week. It's like the machine talks to you. You just have to learn the language. It wasn't mystical. It wasn't supernatural. It was 11 years of intimate, obsessive experience with complex mechanical systems. 11 years of learning that every machine had a personality, a pattern, a set of tells that revealed its condition if you knew how to read them. Vibration frequencies, temperature gradients, the particular sound of an engine that was working versus an engine that was working wrong versus an engine that was about to stop working entirely. He walked slowly around the helicopter. He wasn't looking at anything specific yet. He was getting a feel for it the way a doctor walks into a room and starts reading a patient before he's even opened the chart. He crouched near the landing gear. He stood and looked at the engine cowling. He pressed his palm against the tail boom and held it there for a moment. Behind him, he could hear Vera talking in a low, controlled voice to one of the suits. He caught fragments noon, Hartwell Group 42 million. He filed it away. The investor meeting was for serious money. That explained the pressure. That explained some of the hostility. "Can I look at your maintenance log?" he asked without turning around. A pause. Then footsteps and a tablet was placed in front of him. He took it and started scrolling. The log was thorough, or it looked thorough, but Ethan had spent enough time with maintenance documentation to know the difference between a record that was accurate and a record that was neat, and this one was very, very neat. Almost choreographed. The kind of neat that happened when someone was managing appearances rather than managing a machine. He handed the tablet back without commenting. He moved to the engine compartment. One of the 5 engineers, young guy, tired eyes, the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been staring at screens for 8 hours, stepped aside to give him room. He looked like he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if he was allowed to. "What did you check?" Ethan asked him quietly. The engineer glanced toward Vera's group, then back at Ethan. "Everything on the diagnostic tree. We ran the full software suite twice. Checked the fuel system, the FADEC hydraulic pressure rotor head. What did the FADEC report?" "That's the thing." The engineer lowered his voice further. "It's not reporting anything. No fault codes. Systems reading nominal across the board. Which is why we can't—" He stopped, shook his head. "It shouldn't be possible. An S-76D has 17 redundant monitoring systems. If there's a failure mode, something should be flagging." "Unless the failure isn't in a monitored system," Ethan said. The engineer stared at him. "Everything on this aircraft is monitored." "Almost everything," Ethan said. He leaned into the engine compartment. Here was the thing about the S-76D that most mechanics who hadn't worked on them extensively didn't fully appreciate. The aircraft was, as of its D-series redesign, almost entirely fly-by-wire and computerized. Which meant that when something went wrong, every trained instinct told you to go to the computers. Go to the data. Go to the software. Because that was where the problems lived in a modern aircraft. And that was exactly why a sufficiently obscure mechanical failure could hide in plain sight. Ethan wasn't looking at the computers. He was looking at the fuel control unit. The physical mechanical fuel control unit, the component that sat upstream of all the electronic monitoring, the piece that governed fuel delivery to the engine before the FADEC ever saw a number. He checked the line connections. He checked the mounting bracket. He stopped. He got closer. He pulled a small flashlight from his toolbox and shone it at a specific bracket on the fuel control system, where a particular safety component, a physical lock that prevented inadvertent changes to the fuel mixture ratio under high vibration conditions, was seated. It was installed. But it was installed at 180 degrees from where it was supposed to be. It was such a small thing. Such a simple thing. The component itself was functional. It wasn't broken. It wasn't defective. It hadn't failed. It had simply been put in upside down during what the maintenance log recorded as a routine fuel system inspection 6 weeks ago. And because it was functional, just installed wrong, every digital diagnostic system on the aircraft read it as nominal. Because to the computers it was. The computers didn't know the orientation of a physical component. The computers knew what the sensors reported, and the sensors reported normal values right up until the moment the helicopter was at a certain RPM under a certain load condition, at which point the incorrectly installed lock allowed a micro-flutter in fuel delivery that compounded into a cascade failure of the engine timing sequence. It wouldn't show up on any screen. It wouldn't show up unless you were looking at it. Unless you put your hands on the machine and looked. Ethan straightened up and turned around. The young engineer was watching him. The other 4 had drifted over at some point and were watching him too. Vera Whitmore was 20 feet away with her arms crossed, and she was watching him with an expression that had lost some of its certainty. "Found it," Ethan said. Dead silence. "Found what?" Vera said. "Your fuel control safety lock. It's been installed inverted since your last fuel system inspection. Your computers can't detect it because the component itself is functional. It's just in the wrong orientation. Under normal operation, it doesn't cause a problem. But at high power settings and rotor RPM above. He glanced at the aircraft spec that was as natural to him as his own birthday. Approximately 95%, the incorrect installation allows a micro-oscillation in fuel delivery that disrupts the engine timing sequence and triggers a protective shutdown. No one spoke. Vera unfolded her arms. She looked at the engineer who'd been working all night. He looked at Ethan, then walked over to look at the component himself. He got close. He used his own flashlight. He was in there for about 10 seconds. When he came back up, his face had done something complicated. "He's right," he said. He didn't look at Vera when he said it. He looked at the floor. It's the fuel control lock. It's inverted." "That's it," one of the other engineers said. "That's it," Ethan said. "A fuel control lock," Vera repeated. Her voice had gone very flat and very quiet, the way voices do when the speaker is working very hard to control them. 5 engineers. One night. And it's a fuel control lock. "It happens," Ethan said, and his voice wasn't unkind. "It's one of the most overlooked components in a fuel system inspection because it's mechanical and it works whether it's right side up or inverted. Whoever did your inspection was moving fast and made a human mistake. The diagnostic software has no way to catch it." "Can you fix it?" she asked. "Already know how to fix it. 20 minutes, maybe less." Another pause. "Then fix it," Vera Whitmore said. And for the first time since he'd walked into that hangar, she sounded like a person asking a question rather than a person issuing a verdict. Ethan reached into his toolbox. "18 minutes later, a hangar that had been filed with failure for 8 straight hours heard an engine come alive. The pilot, a quiet, compact man named Garza, who had said exactly nothing during the entire morning's drama, ran through his startup sequence with the methodical calm of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. Ethan stood to the side and listened, not to the conversation, not to the people around him who were saying things he could hear but wasn't processing. He listened to the engine. It sounded good. It sounded healthy. It sounded like... He frowned. Garza was advancing through the power checks now, and the engine was responding correctly, and the FADEC was reading nominal, and everyone in the hangar was beginning to exhale, beginning to smile, beginning to shift from the particular quiet of crisis into the different louder quiet of relief. Vera was looking at her watch. She was calculating flight time to the meeting location probably, thinking about a shower, a change of clothes, a few minutes to collect herself before she had to walk into a room and convince serious people to give her $42 million. "Shut it down," Ethan said. Everyone looked at him. "Garza," he said, "I need you to shut it down." Garza looked at Vera. Vera looked at Ethan. "What?" Her voice had knives in it again. "I need you to shut it down," he said again. He hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same position, and his voice was still level, but his eyes were fixed on the engine, cowling with the kind of focus that didn't leave room for performance. "There's something else. The engine is running, but it's not right." "It sounds fine," she said. "It sounds fine if you're not listening for the right thing. Mr. Walker." And now the knives were out fully, and she was walking toward him. "I don't know if this is how you typically operate. Find one problem, fix it, then manufacture another one to keep the meter running, but I want to be very clear with you. I have a meeting at noon. I have $42 million in a room waiting for a presentation that requires me to arrive in that helicopter. I have been very patient with this process, and I am done being patient. The engine is running. My pilot is ready. We are done here." "With respect," Ethan said, "you're not done. Excuse me." He finally turned to look at her directly. "Ms. Whitmore, I fixed the component that caused your failure this morning. The engine is running and it will run. You could probably get to your meeting and back without incident." "Probably." He held her gaze. "But there's a secondary vibration in that engine at current operating temperatures that I do not like. It may be nothing. It may be residual from the 9 hours the aircraft sat unrunning with a fuel delivery problem. Or it may be something else. I don't know yet. And I'm not willing to sign off on an aircraft I don't know yet. You don't have to sign off on anything. You're not. Then Garza has to sign off on it. He looked at the pilot. You're type-rated on this aircraft. You've been sitting in that seat listening to this engine. You tell me what you want to do. The hangar was absolutely still. Garza sat in the cockpit with his hands resting on his thighs, and he looked at the instruments, and he looked at the engine cowling through the cockpit glass, and then he looked at Ethan for a long moment. Shut it down, Garza said quietly. Vera's face went through several things at once. Fury, disbelief, and then something underneath both of those that was harder to name, something that looked almost like fear, but not the kind that was afraid of missing a meeting. Garza. He's right, Ms. Whitmore. There's something there. Garza began the shutdown sequence. I've been flying this aircraft for 4 years. That's not right. The engine spun down, and the silence that followed was different from the silences before. Those had been the silence of watching, of judging, of an audience waiting for something to fail. This one was the silence of people who were beginning to realize that the man they'd laughed at that morning might be the only reason they were all still standing in a hangar and not watching a Sikorsky S-76D burn in a field somewhere between Phoenix and wherever Vera Whitmore had been going. Ethan went back to his toolbox. I'm going to need another hour, he said. Minimum. Vera stood very still for a moment. You have 90 minutes, she said. Her voice was different now, not warm, not apologetic. She wasn't there yet. But the knives were put away, and what was left was something closer to level ground. I'll call the meeting venue and ask for a delay. Thank you, Ethan said. He didn't say it to be polite. He said it because he meant it. Then he turned back to the machine. He found it 40 minutes later. It was in the tail rotor drive shaft, a microscopic stress fracture in a coupling that connected 2 sections of the shaft. Invisible to the naked eye under normal lighting. Barely visible even under his flashlight and magnification, a hairline that ran approximately 12 millimeters through the aluminum coupling housing. The kind of fracture that under normal operating conditions might not fail for weeks, or might not fail for 30 seconds at high RPM cruise flight over the Arizona desert. He showed it to Garza first. Garza looked at it for a long time without saying anything. When he climbed out of the cockpit, his face was the kind of face men have when they've just understood something about what almost happened to them. Yeah, Garza said quietly. Yeah, okay. Then Ethan showed it to the young engineer, whose name turned out to be Chris. Chris got close to it with his flashlight for almost 2 full minutes, and when he came back up, his hands were doing something involuntary, a fine tremor that he probably didn't notice. How did you know? Chris said. Vibration frequency, Ethan said. At operating temperature, a fracture that size in that location produces a vibration at about 47 Hertz. Barely perceptible, but if you know what to listen for, none of our diagnostic equipment caught it. The monitoring sensor for that coupling is positioned to detect a failure in the shaft itself, not in the coupling housing. Classic blind spot. He looked at the young engineer. Add it to your inspection list. He walked across the hangar to where Vera Whitmore was standing alone a few feet away from her suits and her handlers, her blazer jacket now held over one arm, and her silk blouse looking less polished than it had an hour ago. She was holding her phone and looking at it, but not actually using it. She looked up when he approached. There's a stress fracture in the tail rotor drive shaft coupling, Ethan said. I'm going to show it to you, and then I'm going to tell you what it means. He walked her to the aircraft and crouched down and showed her. She had to crouch too, which she did without comment, balancing on her heels on the epoxy floor. He pointed his flashlight, and she leaned in and looked for a long time. How serious is it? She asked. If you'd taken off for your meeting this morning, Ethan said, it is possible, not certain possible, that coupling could have failed in flight. A coupling failure in the tail rotor drive shaft at cruise altitude causes a loss of tail rotor effectiveness. That's unrecoverable in most low-altitude scenarios. He waited for her to understand what he was saying. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm telling you the truth. Vera Whitmore stared at the fracture for another moment. Then she stood up, and he stood up, and she was looking at him in a way that was completely different from any way she'd looked at him before. She opened her mouth to say something. And that's when the shouting started. Daniel Cross came through the side door of the hangar like a man who had somewhere urgent to be and was irritated at the universe for not clearing a path. He was the company's chief engineer, though Ethan wouldn't learn his name for another 20 minutes. At that moment, he was just a large, red-faced man in an expensive shirt who stopped when he saw Ethan standing next to the aircraft and looked at Vera with an expression Ethan couldn't fully read. Something between alarm and fury. "What is that doing next to my aircraft?" Daniel said. Vera looked at him. "He found the problem, Daniel. He's not certified to work on this aircraft. Anything he's touched could be considered. He found the problem that your team of certified engineers spent 8 hours not finding," Vera said. Her voice was very quiet. "And then he found a second problem that I think we should have a very serious conversation about." Daniel looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Daniel, and in the particular way that men who have spent years dealing with complex systems learn to read the variables in front of them. Ethan noticed something. Daniel Cross didn't look angry. He looked scared. Not the fear of a man who was worried about company liability or certification protocols or the cost of an additional repair. The fear of a man who knew exactly what that stress fracture was and knew exactly how it had gotten there. "I'd like to see the maintenance records for the last 6 months," Ethan said quietly. He wasn't speaking to Vera. He was speaking to Daniel, watching him. "I handle maintenance records," Daniel said. "Any request for documentation goes through my office." "Then I'll go through your office," Ethan said. "Right now, if that works for you." Daniel's jaw tightened, and Ethan knew. He didn't know everything yet. He didn't know why or how deep it went or how many people were involved. But he knew the thing that changed the entire nature of what this morning had been and what it was going to become. The helicopter hadn't just had a maintenance error. The helicopter had been tampered with. He stood in the middle of a hangar that smelled like money and jet fuel, with a $50 bill sitting somewhere on the floor behind him. And he understood that he had just walked into the middle of something much larger than a broken helicopter. And that fixing the machine had only been the beginning. The engine was silent. The truth was not. Daniel Cross didn't move fast enough. That was the thing Ethan noticed first. Not the anger, not the defensiveness, but the half-second delay between the moment Ethan said, "I'd like to see the maintenance records," and the moment Daniel responded. In a man with nothing to hide, that gap doesn't exist. A man with nothing to hide says, "Sure, follow me," or "They're right over there," or even "You don't have authority to request those." All of those responses are immediate because they're reflexive. They come from a clean conscience or a prepared script. Daniel Cross said nothing for almost a full second. And in that second, Ethan read him the way he read machines. "The maintenance records are proprietary company documentation," Daniel finally said. His voice was controlled now, professional, the kind of controlled that takes effort. "Any external party requesting internal documentation needs to go through our legal office. That's company protocol, and I don't make exceptions even in—" He gestured vaguely at the helicopter at Ethan at the entire morning unusual circumstances. "Daniel!" Vera's voice cut across the hangar like a line drawn in concrete. "He found a stress fracture in the tail rotor drive shaft." Daniel turned to look at her, which he should not have been anywhere near. "Ms. Whitmore, I have to strongly recommend that we have this individual escorted from the property before we go any further. The liability exposure alone—" "There's a fracture in my helicopter," Vera said quietly. "In the tail rotor shaft. In an aircraft I was 40 minutes from flying across the city. I want to know how it got there." Metal fatigue, maintenance cycles. These things happen on high-utilization aircraft. This aircraft has 412 flight hours since its last major inspection, Ethan said. He hadn't moved. He was standing with his arms loose at his sides, his voice even. The S76D tail rotor drive shaft coupling is rated for 1,200 hours minimum. Stress fractures at 400 hours don't come from metal fatigue. They come from impact damage or improper installation or... He paused just briefly, deliberate interference. The word landed in the hangar like a stone dropped in still water. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. Then Daniel laughed. It was a short, sharp sound with no warmth in it. "That is an extraordinarily serious accusation to make without a shred of evidence, Mr. Walker," Ethan said. "Ethan Walker. Mr. Walker, who are you exactly? Who sent you here?" "Because I find it very convenient that a man nobody at this company has ever met walks in off the street, claims to find not one but 2 problems that our entire engineering team missed, and then starts throwing around words like deliberate interference." He looked at Vera. "Vera, think about what you're doing. You're standing in your own hangar listening to a stranger make accusations about your company based on what I can see with my own eyes," Ethan said. "Chris?" The young engineer startled slightly at his name. He was standing near the engine compartment, still holding his flashlight, still looking like a man processing information that had shaken him somewhere fundamental. "Yeah," he said. "You saw the fracture." "I saw it." "You've been doing aircraft maintenance for how long?" Chris hesitated, glancing at Daniel. 6 years. "In your 6 years, have you ever seen a stress fracture in a tail rotor coupling at 400 hours on a well-maintained aircraft?" Another glance at Daniel, longer this time, and Ethan watched the internal fight play out across the young man's face. Loyalty versus honesty, career versus conscience. The pressure of a room full of people waiting for him to say the safe thing. "No," Chris said. "I haven't." Daniel Cross turned on him. "Chris, he asked me a direct question," Chris said. His voice wasn't entirely steady, but it held. "And no, I haven't. Not at 400 hours." The hangar had gone extremely quiet again. The kind of quiet that happens when a room of people simultaneously realizes they are standing at the edge of something much larger than what they thought they came here for. Vera looked at Daniel. "I want to see the maintenance records, all of them. Right now." "Vera, I really must advise." "Daniel." Her voice hadn't risen. It didn't have to. "The maintenance records. Now." For the second time that morning, Ethan watched a man lose a calculation he'd been running. Daniel's face did something ugly for a fraction of a second, a flash of something raw and furious. And then it was gone, and he was nodding professional again, smooth again. "Of course," he said. "I'll pull them up." He walked toward the hangar office. Ethan watched him go. Then he looked at Laura Mitchell, the site safety inspector who had been standing near the back of the group for the entire morning, almost invisible. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with short gray hair and eyes that had been moving and calculating and watching from the moment Ethan walked in. She was the only person in the hangar who hadn't laughed when Vera dropped the $50 bill. "You've been quiet," Ethan said to her. Laura Mitchell looked at him steadily. "I've been listening," she said. "Same as you." "What did you hear?" She glanced toward the hangar office where Daniel had disappeared. "I've been with this company for 3 years," she said slowly. "In that time, I've filed 11 safety recommendation reports. 7 of them were rejected by the chief engineer's office. 2 were modified before they went to the board. 2 disappeared entirely." She paused. "I thought it was bureaucracy. I thought it was budget. I thought..." She stopped. Started again. "When you said deliberate interference, Mr. Walker, you were the first person in this company to say out loud what I've been writing in my private notebooks for 2 years. Ethan looked at her for a moment. "Keep those notebooks," he said quietly. "Don't leave them anywhere they can be accessed." She met his gaze and nodded once. Then Vera was beside him. "What is this?" she said. It wasn't accusatory. For the first time, she sounded like someone asking a genuine question. "What is actually happening here?" "I don't know the full picture yet," Ethan said honestly. But I know that helicopter didn't develop a stress fracture by itself at 400 hours. And I know that the fuel control safety lock didn't install itself inverted. And I know that whoever did your last fuel system inspection and whoever did your last tail rotor inspection are either the same person or they're following the same set of instructions. He looked at her directly. You need to ground your entire fleet until every aircraft gets an independent inspection. Not by your maintenance team, by an outside party. Vera was quiet for a moment. That will cost me the Hartwell meeting. That might cost me the Hartwell deal entirely. Yes, he said. It might. $42 million. Yes. She looked at him for a long time. He didn't fill the silence with reassurance, didn't soften. It didn't give her a way to make the math work in her favor. Because there wasn't one. There was only the truth, and the truth was that she had grounded aircraft in her fleet that she didn't know were safe, and no investor meeting was worth more than that. Something shifted in her face. Not the brittle corporate surface underneath that. Something older and more fundamental. Okay, she said. Ground the fleet. She turned to make calls. She had taken exactly 4 steps when Daniel Cross came back from the hangar office. He was carrying a tablet, and he was smiling. It was a new smile, not the forced professionalism of earlier, not the controlled anger. It was the particular smile of a man who had just found a weapon. I've pulled the maintenance records, Daniel said, and I think we should all take a very close look at them together. He held up the tablet so the screen was visible to the room. Because what I find very interesting, is that the last inspection of the tail rotor driveshaft coupling was performed 3 weeks ago, and the work order was authorized by an external contractor. He turned the screen so Ethan could see it. At the bottom of the digital work order in the authorization field was a name. E. Walker, Walker Aviation and Repair, Phoenix, Arizona. Ethan looked at the screen. Then he looked at Daniel Cross. And Daniel Cross was still smiling. That's not my signature, Ethan said. His voice was completely level. It's your company name, Daniel said. It's your authorization code, Walker Aviation and Repair, Phoenix. The code appears to have been provided during a phone consultation 2 months ago regarding... I have never done any work for this company, Ethan said. I have never issued an authorization code to this company. I have never spoken to anyone at Whitmore Aviation before 8 o'clock this morning. That's a very convenient thing to say, Daniel said, given that we're standing here looking at documentation with your name on it. And there it was. Ethan saw the whole shape of it now, the way you see an aircraft's full silhouette when it rotates on the ramp. The morning had never been about incompetence, or budget constraints, or bureaucratic safety failures. Those were the backdrop. This moment right here was what Daniel Cross had been building toward. The moment when an outside mechanic already dismissed and humiliated would be the name on the documents that explained why an aircraft was sabotaged. A patsy. That was the word. Old ugly word. Ethan Walker, the mechanic. Nobody respected, who nobody would believe, who had already been laughed out of the hangar once, and could be laughed out again, and this time with documentation to back it up. He took a slow breath. Ms. Whitmore, he said, when did you place the call to my shop this morning? Vera frowned. I didn't place it. Sonia did on my behalf. What time? I'm not certain exactly. Early, 6:30, maybe 6:40. My shop's phone records will show exactly what time that call came in, because that will be the first time anyone from this company ever contacted Walker Aviation and Repair. He looked at Daniel. Any authorization bearing my company's name on a document dated prior to this morning is a forgery. That's a very serious accusation, Daniel said smoothly, especially from someone who just walked in off the street. I'd like to see the original, Laura Mitchell said. Daniel's smile flickered. I'm sorry. Laura had moved forward from the back of the group. She was holding a small notebook, physical paper, the kind that couldn't be remotely accessed or deleted. The original work order. Paper copy. Because our maintenance protocol requires a physical signature on all tail rotor system work orders, That's not a recommendation, that's an FAA requirement. I wrote that protocol into our safety manual 2 years ago. If the work order in your system has E. Walker listed as the authorizing contractor, there should be a physical copy with an actual signature somewhere in our filing system. She met Daniel's gaze without flinching. I'd like to see it. Daniel Cross looked at Laura Mitchell, and Laura Mitchell looked right back. The silence stretched for 4 or 5 seconds, and in those seconds, Ethan watched Daniel Cross understand that the game had changed. Because Daniel had prepared for Ethan. He had prepared for Vera's reaction. He had prepared arguments and documentation and the particular social architecture of a man who had been building this for months. But he had not fully prepared for a safety inspector who had been quietly keeping notebooks for 2 years. The physical files are stored off-site, Daniel said, at our archive facility. Which facility? Laura said. The Chandler location. We don't have a Chandler location, Laura said. The hangar was absolutely silent. Our off-site archive, Daniel said, and there was something fraying at the edges of his voice now, the first sign of structural fatigue, the same thing Ethan heard in engines just before something failed. Daniel, Vera said. She wasn't looking at him like a CEO looking at her chief engineer anymore. She was looking at him like a person who had just opened a door they expected led one place and found it led somewhere else entirely. What physical facility? Vera, I think what we need to do is... Daniel. Just the name. Nothing else. But the way she said it filled the entire hangar. He stopped. I want every physical maintenance document for every aircraft in this fleet, Vera said. On this table. She pointed at the workbench along the hangar wall. In the next hour. And I want Laura present for every page. She turned to Ethan. And I want you here. Daniel's face had gone through about 6 different emotions in the last 30 seconds and settled on something that wasn't quite any of them. I'll need to make some calls, he said carefully. Make them from here, Vera said, where I can see you. It was the first time Ethan felt something close to respect for her. Not because of the authority or the control he'd seen people throw authority around all his life, and it didn't impress him. It was the speed. The moment she understood something was wrong, she acted. No hedging, no protecting her own comfort, no looking for the version of events that was least disruptive. She just moved toward the truth. That took a certain kind of courage that had nothing to do with a corner office. Daniel Cross made no move to make any calls. Instead, he did something that none of them expected. He sat down, not on a chair. He sat on the edge of the workbench heavily, the way a person sits when the energy has gone out of them, and he looked at the floor and the mask came off entirely. Not in a dramatic way, more like a slow exhale that started somewhere deep and just kept going. Daniel, Vera said quietly, what did you do? He didn't answer immediately. The engineers were frozen. Laura had her notebook open and her pen ready, and her face was perfectly deliberately blank. Garza was still in the cockpit of the helicopter, though the engine was down, and he had turned in his seat and was watching through the glass. I didn't intend for anyone to get hurt, Daniel said. His voice was different now. Not smooth, not professional. Just tired. That's the first thing. Whatever else you think about any of this, I never intended for anyone to get hurt. But you intended for the helicopter to fail, Ethan said. Daniel looked at him. The failure was designed to be non-catastrophic. A ground failure. Something that would ground the aircraft before it flew. It was calculated. It was... He stopped, pressed his fingers against his eyes for a moment. It was supposed to be something that created a crisis, not a catastrophe. Something that made Vera look like she couldn't manage the company's assets. Something the board could point to. And the stress fracture, Ethan said. Daniel was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. The fracture was a separate issue. Was it? Another pause. The coupling was from a batch that I knew had marginal quality control. I expedited it through without the standard incoming inspection. I told myself it would probably be fine, that it would just be another maintenance issue that added to the picture. He stopped again. I told myself a lot of things. The hangar was so quiet that Ethan could hear the building's ventilation system cycling. "You were trying to take control of the company," Vera said. "It wasn't a question. I built this company," Daniel said, and for the first time there was something raw in it, something that had been burning behind the professional facade for what was probably a very long time. "I was here before you. I built the maintenance infrastructure, the safety protocols, the vendor relationships. I spent 8 years building this company, and then the board brought in a 28-year-old with an MBA and a last name, and everything I built became her backdrop." He looked at Vera. "I've watched you make decisions that I knew were wrong. I've watched you override recommendations I'd spent months developing. I've watched the board look through me to look at you because you're—" He stopped himself, pressed his lips together. "I thought if the board saw a major operational failure, they would see that they needed someone with actual operational experience in that chair. Someone who understood the machines." "You're not wrong about some of that," Vera said, and her voice was quiet and honest in a way that cost her something. "You're not wrong that I've made mistakes. You're not wrong that I've overridden recommendations I should have listened to more carefully." She paused. "But you put a fractured coupling in a tail rotor shaft. You put my pilot's life at risk. You put every person who was supposed to board that helicopter at risk. And you were going to frame a man who had nothing to do with any of this." She looked at Ethan for a moment, then back at Daniel. "Whatever your grievances are, there's no version of this that ends anywhere other than where we are right now." Daniel looked at the floor. Ethan said nothing. He had been in enough situations where speaking would have filled a silence that needed to stay empty. This was one of those. After a moment, Daniel reached into his pocket and placed his access badge on the workbench beside him. He set it down gently like something he'd been carrying for a long time. "The competitor I was negotiating with is Arcturus Systems," he said. "They were going to bring me in as chief operations officer when Whitmore's board removed Vera and the company went into restructuring. There are emails. They're on my personal laptop, not the company server." He looked at Laura. "You'll want those." Laura Mitchell was already writing, and Ethan stood in the middle of it all and felt something he hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. He thought about Mia, about the way she watched him from doorways doing math she shouldn't have to do. He thought about the invoices on the kitchen table. He thought about Route 9 and the lease that was 3 months behind and the clients who'd been going to the big certified firms instead of a small family garage. He thought about the $50 bill wherever it was on that epoxy floor and what it was supposed to mean about who he was and what he was worth. He thought about Colonel Reyes, who had given his name to a stranger's assistant at 6:30 in the morning because 11 years of shared experience meant something, and because sometimes the only thing a man has that no one can take from him is his reputation among people who actually know the quality of his work. He thought about all of it, and then he picked up his toolbox, walked over to Chris and said quietly, "Walk me through your tail rotor inspection protocol. Start from the beginning. I want to make sure you know what to look for when you do this independently." Chris blinked. "Right now?" "Right now," Ethan said. "The helicopter still needs a proper inspection. The company still needs its maintenance team to know what they're doing. None of that changes because of what just happened in here." Chris looked at him for a moment, with something in his expression that Ethan recognized as the look of a young person who has just encountered a version of professionalism they hadn't seen before, the kind that keeps working even when the drama is still happening around it. Then he nodded and picked up his flashlight and followed Ethan to the aircraft. Behind them, Vera Whitmore was on the phone. He could hear Fragment's legal board security, the machinery of consequence, grinding into motion. Laura was still writing in her notebook, calm and thorough, the way she'd apparently been doing for 2 years when no one was listening. Daniel Cross was sitting on the workbench with his badge on the surface next to him, looking at nothing. And Ethan walked a 26-year-old engineer through a proper tail rotor drive shaft inspection, from coupling to yoke to blade pitch links, methodically and completely, because the helicopter was still going to need to fly again someday. And when it did, someone who knew what they were doing needed to be the one to clear it. That was the job. That had always been the job. 40 minutes later, when 2 uniformed security personnel arrived at the hangar and Daniel Cross stood and went with them without being asked. Ethan was still at the aircraft. He didn't watch Daniel leave. He was listening to the machine. But Vera Whitmore watched. And when Daniel was gone, she stood for a long moment in the middle of her hangar with her phone in her hand, and the Hartwell meeting 37 minutes away and already beyond saving. And she looked at the man crouched beside her helicopter with a flashlight and a worn toolbox and grease on his hands, and she felt something settle into place that had been out of alignment for much longer than this morning. She walked over. "Mr. Walker," she said. I owe you an apology." He didn't stop working. "You don't owe me anything, Ms. Whitmore." "I dropped $50 at your feet." "You did." "And I told you to go home." "You did that too." "And if you had—" "I didn't," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. Why not most people would have walked out? Most people would have been justified in walking out. He considered this, clicked off his flashlight, and looked at the aircraft for a moment before he answered. "Because the helicopter needed to be fixed," he said. "And I knew how to fix it. The other stuff," he shrugged slightly, "that's between you and your conscience. The machine doesn't care about any of that." Vera looked at him for a long moment. "The board is going to want a full report," she said. "I'd like you to be part of that process, as a consultant. I want someone independent, someone outside this company, who can help Laura and I go through every piece of maintenance documentation we have, every aircraft, every work order, everything." "I have a shop," Ethan said. "I'll pay for your time." "I have other clients." "I'll work around your schedule." He looked at her. "Why me? You have the engineers. You have Laura. Because you walked in here this morning with a toolbox that looked like it had survived a war," she said, "and you were the only person in this room who was telling the truth the entire time." A pause. "And because I was wrong about you. In about 7 different ways. And in my experience, when you've been that wrong about someone, the correct response is to pay attention to them." Ethan picked up his flashlight again. "I'll think about it," he said. He didn't say yes. Not yet. But for the first time since he'd driven through that gate that morning, he felt something other than the mechanical satisfaction of a problem solved. Something that had more to do with the future than with the present. The machine was telling him something, and he was listening. He said yes on a Tuesday. Not because the money was good, though it was better than anything Walker Aviation and Repair had seen in 3 years. Not because Vera Whitmore had asked twice then, a third time each ask a little more direct and a little less like a CEO negotiating, and a little more like a person who had run out of other options. He said yes because Laura Mitchell called him at 7:15 on a Monday night while he was helping Mia with her long division homework, and Laura said 8 words that settled it. "Ethan, I think there are more aircraft." He handed the pencil to Mia. "Give me 5 minutes, Bug." "Dad." 5 minutes. He walked to the kitchen. "How many more?" "I've been going through the maintenance logs all week," Laura said. "The ones Daniel gave us access to before security walked him out. There are gaps. Not big obvious ones, small ones. A date that doesn't align. A work order number that skips a sequence. A technician's initials on a document when that technician was on leave." She paused. "Individually, each one is explainable. Together they form a pattern I can't ignore." "Which aircraft?" "The Citation, maybe the Robinson." "I need someone who can look at the physical components and tell me if what I'm seeing in the paperwork matches what's actually in the machines." Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter and looked through the doorway at Mia bent over her homework pencil, moving her small face, doing the focused frown she'd inherited from him. "I'll be there at 7, he said. He told the shop's one full-time employee, a retired auto mechanic named Hector, who could do basic avionics work to handle the 2 cars they had in for the week. He drove to the Whitmore hangar before sunrise on Tuesday, and by the time Phoenix was fully awake, he and Laura had already found the first one, The Citation jet's left main landing gear actuator had been partially disassembled and reassembled with one of the internal tension springs seated incorrectly. Not removed, seated incorrectly. Wrong position in the retaining assembly. Under normal operations, the gear would extend and retract without problem. Under specific conditions, specifically a hard landing scenario or a crosswind landing, requiring full actuator travel, the incorrect spring seating would cause the actuator to bind midway through the retraction cycle. The landing gear would jam. Partially extended, partially retracted. At landing speed, that was not a survivable configuration. Ethan photographed it, documented it, did not touch it until Laura had seen it and recorded it in her notebook, and they had both signed a paper chain of custody log she'd set up for exactly this purpose because she'd known something like this was coming before any of them said the words out loud. "How long has this aircraft been in service since that actuator was last touched?" he asked. Laura checked her records. 14 months. Ethan thought about that for a moment. 14 months. The aircraft had been flying for 14 months with that spring seated incorrectly, and by sheer luck, or by Daniel's alleged calculation, that the failure would only occur in specific extreme conditions, nobody had been killed. Nobody had even known. "We need to call the FAA," Ethan said. Laura was already writing. "I called them yesterday," she said without looking up. "They're sending an inspector Thursday. I wanted you to see this with your own eyes first." He looked at her. "You called the FAA before we confirmed the second aircraft." "I called the FAA the day after you left the hangar last week," she said. She finally looked up. "When Daniel sat down on that workbench and started talking, I knew we were past the point where this was a company internal matter. I have a legal obligation as a safety inspector, and I have a personal one as a human being." She held his gaze. "I just needed to make sure I wasn't the only one who could see what I was seeing." "You weren't," Ethan said. She nodded once, went back to writing. He went back to the aircraft. By noon, they'd confirmed the citation and had started on the Robinson. By 2:30, they'd found nothing in the Robinson, which was either a relief or meant it hadn't been Daniel's next target yet. Ethan wasn't sure which reading he trusted more. He cataloged both possibilities and kept his hands moving. That was the week that everything changed. He just didn't know it yet. The first sign came on Thursday morning 40 minutes before the FAA inspector arrived. Ethan was in the hangar going through the physical coupling records he'd requested from the parts supplier, trying to trace whether the marginal quality batch Daniel admitted to expediting was documented anywhere in the supply chain when his phone started ringing. Not a number he recognized. He answered out of the same reflex that had answered every call since the Air Force. "Walker? Mr. Walker." The voice was male, somewhere in its 50s, the particular flatness of someone who was used to delivering information without editorializing. "My name is Richard Bowen. I'm a senior investigative reporter with the Arizona Business Journal. I'm working on a story about the situation at Whitmore Aviation Technologies, and I'd like to ask you a few questions." Ethan's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "How did you get this number?" "Mr. Walker, I want to be straightforward with you. We've received information from a source close to the Whitmore situation who has suggested that the maintenance failures at Whitmore Aviation may have been caused by an unlicensed outside contractor. The name provided to us was Walker Aviation and Repair." And there it was, even with Daniel Cross sitting in a police station somewhere giving statements. Even with Laura's meticulous documentation and Ethan's photographs and the chain of custody that Laura had started before anyone even knew they'd need it, the story that Daniel had planted was still moving. Like something that had been set in motion and didn't need its creator anymore to keep rolling. "I've never done maintenance work for Whitmore Aviation," Ethan said. "Before last week, I had never set foot in that hangar. The documentation bearing my company name was falsified. The Arizona Attorney General's office and the FAA are both aware of this. Are you aware that a statement attributed to a Whitmore Aviation board member is currently circulating that suggests the company is considering all potential sources of liability for the maintenance failures?" "I'm not aware of that, no." And are you aware that there are posts circulating on social media identifying Walker Aviation and Repair as connected to the failures? The posts include your shop address. Ethan was quiet for 2 seconds. No, he said. I wasn't aware of that. He hung up and immediately called his shop. Hector picked up on the second ring. Hey boss, we've got a situation. I know, Ethan said. What's happening? Somebody put something on Facebook. Don't know who posted it original, but it's being shared. Says Walker Aviation was connected to the helicopter failure. Says you're unlicensed. Hector paused. I've had 3 calls this morning. 2 of them were clients canceling jobs. Third one was somebody I've never spoken to in my life telling me what he thought of you. In some words, I'm not going to repeat. Ethan closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them. Keep the shop open, he said. The Brennan job is still on the books. Keep it on the books. Do the Brennan job. I'll be there this afternoon. He hung up. Then he stood in the hangar and let the weight of what was happening settle onto him, because the alternative was not acknowledging it, and Ethan Walker had spent his entire adult life refusing to pretend a problem wasn't there because looking at it was uncomfortable. The problem was, this Daniel Cross might be in custody, but Daniel Cross had had time to make plans. And a man who could plant a forged work order in a maintenance system, who could negotiate secretly with a competitor while running a company's safety infrastructure, who could calculate the precise failure conditions of incorrectly installed components that man had made contingency plans. The social media posts weren't Daniel typing from a police station. They were something he'd set up to run, whether he was available to run it or not. Ethan was the exit door. If the narrative stuck unlicensed contractor rogue outside mechanic Walker Aviation responsible, then Daniel became less of a saboteur and more of a manager who'd made the mistake of letting the wrong outside party too close to his aircraft. Corporate negligence versus deliberate sabotage. Very different legal territory. It was well constructed. Ethan had to give him that. He was still standing there when Vera Whitmore came through the hangar door at 11:47 minutes before she'd been expected. She was moving the way people move when something has happened that they're still processing kinetically, not quite running, but not walking either her heels on the epoxy, making a sound like punctuation. Have you seen the news? She said. I've seen some of it. The Business Journal is running a story this afternoon. I just got off the phone with our PR team. The headline is... She stopped, looked at him. Something in her expression was fighting itself. The headline is going to say that Whitmore Aviation is investigating an unlicensed outside mechanic in connection with the maintenance failures. The hangar air was very still. They're going to name you, she said. I assumed that. Ethan. She used his first name, and it was the first time she had, and neither of them acknowledged it, but both of them noticed it. Our legal team is recommending that we issue a statement that focuses the investigation on the maintenance process, rather than specifically identifying Daniel as the primary actor until criminal charges are formally filed. They say it protects the company's position in potential civil litigation. Ethan looked at her steadily. What does that mean in plain language? It means they want to release something that's technically accurate, but leaves the public narrative open. Something that neither confirms nor denies your involvement. She met his gaze. I told them no. I told them we are not releasing anything that leaves a false impression about you standing, and they told me that was my call to make but strongly advised against it. She exhaled. I wanted you to know that I told them no. Something in Ethan's chest shifted. Not much, but something. Thank you, he said. I haven't fixed it yet. The story is still going to run. What I've done is buy us time to get our own statement out first, but it has to go out in the next 2 hours. She looked at him directly. I need you to go on record. Your words, your account, everything. Our communications team will format it, but the substance has to come from you. I'm not putting words in your mouth. You want a statement? I want the truth, she said, which I understand is what you've been giving me since you walked in here, and which I understand I did not make easy. Ethan picked up his flashlight and his clipboard and set them on the workbench with a precise quietness that had nothing to do with being calm and everything to do with being controlled. He looked at the tools for a moment. Then he looked at Vera. "Is your lawyer going to be in the room when I give this statement? If you want one of your own present, I'll wait." "I don't need one," he said. "Let's go." They were in Vera's office on the building's second floor for 55 minutes. Ethan talked. The communications director recorded. Vera sat across from him and didn't speak except twice, once to clarify a timeline detail, once to say quietly, "Take your time," when he was describing the tail rotor fracture and what it would have meant if the helicopter had flown. The statement went out at 2:17 p.m. By 4 o'clock, the Arizona Business Journal story had been updated twice. By 5:03, aviation industry blogs had picked up Whitmore's statement. By 6:30, the original social media post had been countered enough times that the algorithm was burying it. Ethan was back at his shop by 4:45. Hector had done the Brennan job. The car was finished, parked in the lot, keys on the hook. The shop smelled like motor oil and rubber and the particular dusty warmth of a space that had been worked in for years, and Ethan stood in the middle of it and let that smell hit him the way it always did, grounding, familiar, honest. This was the thing he'd built. This small, struggling, real thing. He checked his messages. The 2 clients who'd canceled had not uncanceled. He had 4 new voicemails he hadn't listened to. He listened to them now. The first was from someone he didn't know, calling him a fraud. The second was from Colonel David Reyes, his voice steady and warm, saying, "Walker, I heard what happened. You did the right thing. Call me when you can." The third was from a mechanic named Torres he'd trained under at Luke Air Force Base 12 years ago, who said, "Don't know if you remember me. I heard your name in connection with the Whitmore thing. I know what kind of mechanic you are. If you need a character witness, I'm there." The fourth was from a reporter from a different outlet wanting a comment. He deleted the first and fourth. He saved the second and third. Then he went and picked up Mia. She was quiet in the car. He could feel her watching him from the passenger seat the way she did when she was deciding whether to ask something or wait. She was 9, and she could read his silences the way he read machines, not perfectly, but better than most adults could. "You heard something at school," he said. "Kaylee's mom told Kaylee that your shop was in trouble." He glanced at her. "What did Kaylee say to you?" "She said her mom said you did something wrong with a helicopter." Ethan nodded slowly and merged onto the freeway. "I didn't do anything wrong with any helicopter," he said. "But some people are saying I did, and it's going to take a little time to sort out." "Do you know who's saying it?" "I have a pretty good idea." Mia was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you're not your regular self?" He didn't answer immediately because the honest answer was complicated, and she deserved the honest answer. "I'm bothered," he said finally. "It bothers me when people say things that aren't true, especially when it affects the shop. The shop is how we keep the lights on and the cheese in your eggs." She almost smiled. Almost. "What are you going to do?" "What I always do," he said. "Keep showing up. Keep doing the work right. Wait for the truth to catch up." "What if it doesn't?" He looked at her for a moment. "It does," he said. "It always does. It just sometimes takes longer than you want it to." She seemed to think about this seriously, the way she thought about everything seriously. And then she said, "Okay," and looked out the window, and that was the end of it. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He read 2 chapters of the book they were going through together, chapter by chapter, every night, and he turned off her light and closed her door and stood in the hallway for a moment doing the math. 3 canceled client jobs this week. The 2 from this morning plus 1 he'd gotten a text about at 5:40. He had the consulting work from Vera, which would cover the lease and the utilities, and Hector's Friday paycheck. But the consulting wasn't permanent. The consulting was a crisis response. And when the crisis was resolved, if it was resolved, Walker Aviation and Repair would be exactly what it had been before last Tuesday. Except now with a news story attached to its name. He sat at the kitchen table, with the invoices face up, because Mia was asleep and there was no one left to hide them from. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He opened it. "Back off the Whitmore investigation." You don't know what you're in the middle of. This is not a warning I'm required to give you." He stared at the message for a long time. Then he screenshot it, forwarded it to Vera and Laura and the AG contact he'd been given earlier in the week, and put his phone face down on the table. He looked at the invoices. He picked up a pen, and he started doing the math. The next morning came the way bad weeks sometimes run, not with a single disaster, but with a series of smaller ones arriving close enough together that you can't fully absorb one before the next one hits. He was at the shop by 7. By 7:45, a client he'd had for 4 years, a private pilot named Hartwell, no relation to the investor group, just a man who'd brought his small Cessna to Ethan every 6 months for 3 years, called to say he was taking his business elsewhere. "I don't have a choice, Ethan," Hartwell said, and he sounded genuinely uncomfortable, which somehow made it worse. "My insurance carrier is asking about our service providers in light of the news coverage. I can't fight that battle right now." "I understand," Ethan said. "I'm sorry." "I know you are." He hung up. By 9 o'clock there was a news van parked across the street from the shop. Not close enough to be trespassing. Just visible. Just enough to remind everyone who drove past that something was happening here. Something that justified a camera being pointed at it. Hector looked at it through the shop window. "Want me to go talk to them?" "No," Ethan said. "Don't engage, just work." "What about the 3 people who showed up on social media tagging the shop's name in?" "Don't engage," Ethan said again. "Do the work." At 10:20, Laura Mitchell called. "The FAA inspector has been here since 8, she said. "He spent 2 hours with the citation actuator. He's confirmed our findings." A pause. "He also found something we didn't." Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. "What?" The avionics update that was installed on the Citation 4 months ago was a non-certified modification. The documentation was forged to show FAA approval. The actual modification was sourced from an unauthorized aftermarket supplier and this is the part that gets complicated, an aftermarket supplier that is a subsidiary of Arcturus Systems. The company Daniel had been negotiating with. Ethan sat down on a shop stool. "They weren't just trying to damage Whitmore Aviation," he said. "No," Laura said. "They were installing their own systems inside our aircraft. If things had gone the way Daniel planned, if the board had removed Vera and Arcturus had come in as a restructuring partner, they would have had proprietary systems inside 3 Whitmore aircraft. Systems they manufactured. Systems only they could fully service." Her voice was steady, but underneath it was the specific anger of a person who has spent years filing safety reports that disappeared into someone's desk drawer. This was never about Daniel's ego, Ethan. Or it wasn't only that. This was a corporate acquisition play with a body count waiting to happen. He let that sit for the moment. "Have you told Vera?" "I'm calling her next. I wanted you to know first." A brief pause. "You were the one who didn't walk out the door when she dropped $50 at your feet. It felt right that you hear it first." He didn't say anything immediately. He was processing something that went beyond the technical specifics, the full architecture of what had been built around this situation, the layers of it, the patience and the planning and the cold calculation that sat underneath what he'd walked into that Tuesday morning, thinking he was just going there to fix a helicopter. "Laura," he said. "Yeah." "Are you safe, physically safe?" A longer pause than he expected. "I've been thinking about that," she said carefully. "I've been thinking about the fact that I've filed 11 safety reports in 3 years, and the person who buried 7 of them is now in custody. And I've been thinking about whoever sent you that text message last night, because Vera forwarded it to me, and the number has already been traced to a prepaid phone purchased in Tempe 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks ago, before Ethan had ever set foot in that hangar. "Someone knew you were going to need a warning," he said. "Someone knew this was going to fall apart eventually," Laura said. "And they prepared for it. Go somewhere you don't usually go tonight," he said. "Tell Vera where you'll be. Don't tell anyone else." "Already planned?" she said. And then, almost as an afterthought, I spent 3 years trying to get people in this company to listen to me, Ethan. And then you walked in and listened in about 40 seconds. Her voice had something different in it now, something that cost her to say. I just want you to know that means something to me. He didn't deflect it. He let it be what it was. You kept the notebooks, he said. That's why this is unraveling. You kept the truth on paper for 2 years when nobody would hear it. I just happened to be the guy standing there when it was ready to come out. He paused. The notebooks saved lives, not me. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going to go call Vera, she said. Go call Vera. He hung up and sat on the shop stool for a while longer. The news van was still across the street. His phone buzzed again. He looked at it, expecting another unknown number, another reporter, another piece of the world caving in around the small structure of his ordinary life. It was Mia's school. His heart did the thing it always did when that number appeared. He answered on the first ring. Mr. Walker, the school secretary, Mrs. Patton. I'm calling because we had a small situation at pickup time this morning. Mia is fine. She's completely fine. But another student said something to her on the playground, and Mia responded by telling the student that. And I'm quoting here that, my dad does the right thing even when it's hard, and that's more than I can say for some people's parents. Ethan put his hand over his mouth. The other students' parents are requesting a meeting, and I want to be clear that from our side, we don't consider Mia to have done anything wrong, but I wanted you to be informed, and I'll be there at 3, he said. Of course. And Mr. Walker for what it's worth. Mrs. Kellerman overheard the whole thing from her classroom window. She said to tell you she agrees with your daughter's assessment. He sat with the phone in his hand after hanging up, and he felt something that had been wound very tight inside him since Monday morning begin not to loosen exactly but to settle. The way an aircraft does when it finds its trim and stops fighting itself. His daughter knew who he was. In the middle of a week, where half the city was being told he was something he wasn't, his daughter, who watched him from doorways doing math she shouldn't have to do, who heard his voice go different on work calls, who could read his silences better than most people could read words. His daughter had stood on a playground and defended his character without hesitation. That was worth more than he knew how to say. The news van across the street was still there. The invoices on his kitchen table were still there. Hartwell had still canceled. None of that had changed. But Ethan Walker got up off the shop stool, picked up his clipboard, and went back to work. Because the work was still there too. And it wasn't going to do itself. He was 3 hours into a routine fuel system check on a Piper Arrow when Vera's number came up on his phone. He set down the wrench, wiped his hands, and answered. Ethan. Her voice was tight, in a way he was learning to read not panic, but controlled urgency. I just got off the phone with the FAA inspector, and I just got off the phone with my board chair. A beat. The board is calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Because of the Arcturus connection. Partly? Something shifted in her voice. And partly because 3 board members received emails this morning, from an anonymous address with attachments. A pause long enough to feel deliberate. The attachments are forged communications. Made to look like exchanges between me and the Arcturus account. Made to look like I was aware of the unauthorized modifications. Ethan went completely still. They're saying it was you, he said. That's what the emails suggest, she said. That I was using Daniel as a layer of deniability for a deal I was running myself. Her voice cracked just slightly, just once. Ethan, I did not do this. I want to be absolutely clear. I know you have no reason to. I know you didn't do it, he said. A silence. How can you know that? Because if you'd been running this yourself, you'd have had a better story ready when I found the fracture. You were genuinely blindsided. He thought for a second. And because whoever sent those emails to the board sent me a text message last night telling me to back off. They're not done. They're still running the play. Daniel is in custody. Daniel had partners, Ethan said. The Arcturus subsidiary, the prepaid phone, the forged board emails, that's not one person. That's an operation. And part of that operation has always been making sure there's someone to take the fall who isn't Arcturus. First, it was going to be me. Now it's going to be you. Vera was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then, "What do I do?" And there it was. The question that stripped away the title and the blazer and the investor meetings and the $42 million. Just a person asking another person what to do when the ground has gone unstable beneath them. Ethan picked up his wrench. "You go to the board meeting," he said. "You walk in there with Laura's notebooks and the FAA inspector's preliminary report and every piece of documentation we've put together this week. You don't defend yourself. You present the evidence. You let the truth do the work." He paused. "And you ask for someone with actual expertise in corporate sabotage investigations to be brought in. Not because you can't handle it, because this is bigger than what either of us thought it was." "Will you come?" she said. "To the meeting." He thought about the news van across the street. He thought about Hartwell canceling. He thought about Mia on the playground. He thought about the $50 bill wherever it had ended up on that hangar floor. "What time?" he said. 8 a.m.? "I'll be there at 7:30, he said. "Don't go in before I get there." He hung up. He stood in his shop in the quiet of mid-afternoon, surrounded by tools and machines and the particular honest smell of work being done. And he understood that whatever he'd thought this was when it started a consulting job, a simple investigation, a chance to help a company sort out a safety crisis, it had become something else. It had become a fight. And Ethan Walker knew how to fight. Not with noise, not with anger, not with the kind of performance that impressed audiences. With precision, with patience, with the absolute bedrock refusal to let a machine leave his hands in a condition he couldn't stand behind. He picked up his tools. He went back to the Piper Arrow. And tomorrow would come when it came. He arrived at 7:22. Laura Mitchell was already there. She was sitting in her car in the parking structure with a paper coffee cup and her notebook open on the steering wheel, writing. When she saw his truck pull in, she got out immediately, and he could tell from the way she moved that she hadn't slept much. "How bad is it?" he asked. She handed him a printed email. "This is what the board members received yesterday. All 3 of them. Different send times, same content, anonymous routing through a VPN that the IT team traced to Eastern Europe." She watched him read it. "It's detailed, Ethan. Whoever wrote this knew the internal language of Whitmore Aviation. The terminology, the vendor names, the specific project codes. This wasn't written by someone on the outside looking in. He read it twice. The email was constructed as a chain of communications between a Vera Whitmore account and an Arcturus project manager, discussing the unauthorized avionics modifications as a planned phase of a pre-merger integration. The language was technical specific and almost entirely believable. If you didn't know what Ethan knew, if you hadn't stood in that hangar and watched Vera's genuine shock unfold in real time, the email made a coherent and damning story. "Who else inside the company would have had access to those project codes?" he asked. "Besides Daniel." Laura thought for a second. 4 people. His direct reports. 2 of them have already been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. The other 2 are Marcus Webb, our VP of Operations, and a senior tech named Priya Okafor. "You trust them?" "Marcus, yes, completely. He's been here longer than Daniel. He's the one who originally hired me, and he's the person who suggested I keep physical notebooks when I came to him 2 years ago with concerns about the safety reports disappearing." She paused. "He said he couldn't prove anything, but he told me to write everything down and never store it digitally. I thought he was being paranoid. Turns out he was being careful." "And Priya Okafor," Laura's expression shifted, just slightly. "Priya is excellent. She's technically brilliant. She was also Daniel's most trusted engineer for 4 years." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know, Ethan. I genuinely don't know." He handed the email back. "Is she in the building?" "She's been in since 6. She was the one who pulled the avionics modification logs for the FAA inspector yesterday." Laura paused. She flagged the discrepancy herself. She walked into my office with the documentation and laid it on my desk and said, and I'm quoting, "I think I know what this is, and I think I've been used." Ethan looked at her. "She was crying," Laura said quietly. "Not performed crying, the real kind. The kind where you're angry at yourself more than anyone else." She folded the email and put it in her notebook. "She told me she expedited 2 of the component orders on Daniel's instruction without knowing what they were for. She thought she was cutting bureaucratic tape on routine parts sourcing. She had no idea the components were from an Arcturus subsidiary." Laura met his gaze. "I believe her, but I also know that believing someone and being certain about them are 2 different things." "Keep her close," Ethan said. "Don't tell her more than she needs to know for her immediate function, but don't push her out. If she's genuinely on the right side of this, you need her technical knowledge. If she's not," he thought about it, "you need to know where she is." Laura nodded slowly. "That's cold." "It's careful," he said. "There's a difference." He checked his watch. 7:31. "Where's Vera?" "Conference room on 3. She's been here since 6:15. Laura started walking toward the building entrance. "She called her attorney last night. Personal attorney, not company counsel. He's upstairs already." "She listened to what I told her." "She did better than listen," Laura said. "She had her communications team put together a complete documented timeline of the entire week. Every action, every finding, every piece of evidence in chronological order with source citations. She called Marcus Webb at 10 o'clock last night and had him compile a parallel record of every time he witnessed Daniel Cross override a safety recommendation in the last 2 years. She glanced at him sideways. She also called Colonel Reyes. Ethan looked at her. "Why?" "Because Reyes sits on the advisory board of the National Business Aviation Association. And because Reyes knows people at the FAA regional office that our assigned inspector doesn't have direct access to. And because—" Laura almost smiled. "She said you trusted him, and that was enough for her." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about a woman who had dropped a $50 bill at his feet 8 days ago with the absolute unexamined confidence of someone who had never had to question her own first impressions. And he thought about how much distance a person could travel in 8 days if they were actually willing to move. They went inside. The conference room on the 3rd floor had 7 people in it when Ethan walked in. At 7:38, Vera, her personal attorney, Marcus Webb, Laura, the FAA inspector, whose name was Gordon Marsh, and 2 board members who had apparently decided to arrive early. A 3rd board member came in 2 minutes after Ethan. The full board was 5 people. The chair, a man named Philip Hartley, arrived at 7:55 and did not acknowledge Ethan when he sat down. He acknowledged Vera with a nod that was so precisely calibrated to communicate nothing that it communicated everything. Hartley was in his late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore authority the way other men wore cologne so consistently that he probably didn't notice it anymore. He set a leather portfolio on the table, uncapped a pen, and looked around the room with an expression that suggested he had been in difficult meetings for 40 years and had never been the person who blinked first. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "given the complexity of what's before us, I'd like to start by establishing some basic facts. Is there any disagreement that serious maintenance failures were discovered in at least 2 Whitmore Aviation aircraft last week?" "No disagreement," Vera said. "Is there any disagreement that Daniel Cross, our former chief engineer, is currently in the custody of the Arizona Attorney General's office facing preliminary charges related to those failures?" "No disagreement." "And is there any disagreement that this board received communications yesterday morning suggesting that you may have had prior knowledge of and possibly directed certain unauthorized modifications to company aircraft?" "There is complete and absolute disagreement with that characterization," Vera said. Her voice was level. "Which I intend to demonstrate thoroughly this morning." Hartley looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. "And you are—" "Ethan Walker," Ethan said. "Walker Aviation and Repair." The board member to Hartley's left, a woman named Sandra Chen, who Ethan would later learn had built 3 technology companies before joining the Whitmore board, leaned forward slightly. "You're the mechanic who first identified the failures." "I am." You're also the individual named in the original social media reports as connected to the failures. My company name appeared in falsified documentation planted by Daniel Cross, Ethan said. I had no previous relationship with Whitmore Aviation before last Tuesday morning. Hartley's pen moved. You understand the board's position here, Mr. Walker. You have a potential financial interest in the outcome of this investigation. Your presence in this room could be characterized as, Mr. Hartley. Gordon Marsh, the FAA inspector, spoke for the first time. He was a quiet man who had been sitting with his hands folded on the table since 7:55. And when he spoke, the room paid attention the way rooms pay attention to people who don't speak often. I've been the FAA's Senior Aviation Safety Inspector for this region for 11 years. I've investigated 43 maintenance failure incidents in that time. I'd like to offer the board my preliminary assessment of the situation at Whitmore Aviation, if that's acceptable. Hartley looked at him. Please. The failures identified in the Whitmore S-76D helicopter and the Citation jet are in my professional assessment not consistent with negligence, budgetary shortcutting, or routine maintenance error. They are consistent with deliberate, technically sophisticated interference by someone with detailed knowledge of aircraft systems and FAA certification processes. He opened a folder in front of him. The unauthorized avionics modification in the Citation jet used components manufactured by a subsidiary of Arcturus Systems, sourced through channels designed to obscure their origin. The documentation trail was constructed to pass routine internal review. It would not have passed external audit. He paused. Mr. Walker identified the primary failure in the S-76D in under an hour. He then identified a secondary failure, a tail rotor driveshaft fracture, that in my professional opinion represented a serious risk of catastrophic in-flight failure. The fact that Mr. Walker refused to clear the aircraft for flight despite pressure to do so, and that he subsequently cooperated fully with this office's investigation, is not consistent with the behavior of someone responsible for those failures. Silence in the room. Sandra Chen was looking at Ethan differently now. Philip Hartley was looking at his portfolio and his pen was not moving. The communications your board received yesterday, Marsh continued, were forwarded to my office by Ms. Whitmore's attorney at 6:45 this morning. We have routed them to the FBI's Cyber Division, who has jurisdiction over the VPN routing used to send them. It is the preliminary assessment of my office that those communications are fabricated. He closed the folder. That's what I can tell you at this stage of the investigation. Hartley looked up from his portfolio. He looked at Vera. He looked at the FAA inspector. He looked finally and briefly at Ethan. Ms. Whitmore, he said, you mentioned you intended to demonstrate your position thoroughly. Please proceed. What followed was 51 minutes that Ethan would later describe to Colonel Reyes accurately as the most methodical dismantling of a false narrative he had ever witnessed. Vera presented the timeline. Laura presented the notebooks, 2 years of safety reports filed and suppressed with dates, document numbers, and Marcus Webb's parallel record of the board meetings where Daniel Cross had presented sanitized versions of Laura's original findings. Gordon Marsh walked through the technical evidence. Vera's attorney presented the phone records establishing that Walker Aviation and Repair's first contact with Whitmore Aviation was the call at 6:47 a.m. on the morning of the helicopter failure 11 days ago. Ethan spoke twice. Once to explain the specific nature of the failures and why they required expert knowledge to create without triggering diagnostic systems. Once to answer a question from Sandra Chen, who asked him directly, in your professional opinion, based on everything you've examined, was this a planned attempt to damage this company? Yes, he said. It was planned. It was executed by someone with deep technical knowledge and at least one external partner. And it was planned with enough lead time that contingency communications were prepared in advance for scenarios where the primary plan failed. He looked at her steadily. The text message I received Wednesday night telling me to back off was sent from a phone purchased 3 weeks before I ever set foot in this company's hangar. Whoever sent it knew that there was a possibility I'd be involved. Which means they were aware of this investigation before I was. The board member to Hartley's right, a quiet man named Ellison, who had not spoken a word for the entire meeting, said, "How is that possible?" I don't know yet, Ethan said. But it means the investigation isn't complete. The room went very still at that. Then, Philip Hartley did something that surprised Ethan. He set his pen down on the portfolio. He pressed both hands flat on the table. And he looked at Vera Whitmore with an expression that had lost the careful neutrality of the past hour and replaced it with something older and more tired. "Vera," he said, "I have to tell you something." The room held its breath. "I received an email 3 months ago," Hartley said, "from an address I didn't recognize. It contained what appeared to be internal financial projections, suggesting that Whitmore Aviation was significantly overvalued and that the company would benefit from external partnership." He paused. "I did not respond to the email. I forwarded it to our investor relations team and told them to flag it as unsolicited contact. I did not mention it to you because at the time, it seemed like routine competitive noise." He looked at the table for a moment. "In light of what I've heard this morning, I believe that email was part of the same operation." Vera looked at him for a long moment. "You've been carrying that?" "For 3 months, yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know what it was," he said. "And because I have not always," he stopped, and the pause was the kind that costs a person something. "I have not always given you the benefit of the doubt that your work warranted, and I am aware of that. And I am telling you this now because you have sat in this room for an hour and demonstrated systematically that my doubts were unjustified." He picked up his pen again. "I should have told you about the email when I received it. I apologize." Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Sandra Chen said quietly, "So should we all." She looked around the table at the other board members and then at Vera. "You've been running this company for 3 years. You built the revenue line from 40 million to 112 million. You hired Laura Mitchell and gave her a safety brief with actual authority, which is more than the previous administration did. And when this happened, when someone went to extraordinary lengths to undermine you, the first thing you did was call the FAA and bring in an independent examiner." She folded her hands. "I don't think this board has adequately communicated to you how much we trust your leadership. I'm communicating it now." Vera sat with that for a moment. She didn't deflect. It didn't minimize it. Didn't redirect to the business agenda. She just sat with it. And then she said, "Thank you, Sandra. I appreciate that more than you know." She looked around the table. "Now I need to tell you what I want to do next." She laid out 4 things. Independent inspection of the remaining company assets. Formal cooperation agreement with the FBI cyber investigation. A restructured maintenance oversight protocol with Laura Mitchell as its director reporting directly to the board rather than through engineering. And a new position, an independent safety consultancy role, externally hired, non-company reporting to the board quarterly. She looked at Ethan when she said the 4th one. He looked back at her. "I'd like to offer that role to Ethan Walker," she said, "on a consulting basis with a scope that includes Whitmore Aviation and any subsidiary operations. I want an independent set of eyes on every aircraft in this fleet permanently. Not because I don't trust my team, I do, and I'm going to rebuild that team carefully, but because what happened here was allowed to happen partly because the people who were seeing the truth didn't have a structure that let them be heard." She held his gaze. "You heard Laura in 40 seconds. I'd like that to be a permanent part of how this company operates." Ethan said nothing for a moment. He looked at Laura, who was looking at her notebook. He looked at Gordon Marsh, who was looking at the ceiling in the way of a man who has carefully removed himself from a corporate conversation that was outside his jurisdiction. He looked at Marcus Webb, who was looking at him with the specific expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular thing to happen for longer than anyone knew. "I'll need to think about it," he said. "Of course," Vera said. "And I have conditions." "I expected you would. Walker Aviation stays operational. I won't close the shop or suspend client work. Whatever arrangement we reach has to work around that." He paused. "And the position has to be structured so that it doesn't compromise my independence. I'm not an employee of Whitmore Aviation. I'm not subject to Whitmore Aviation's internal chain of command on matters of safety assessment. If I find something wrong, I report it to the board and to the FAA simultaneously, and that is not optional. Agreed, Vera said. She didn't hesitate. Then I'll think about it, he said. Philip Hartley almost smiled. Mr. Walker, in my 40 years of board governance, that's the most conditional acceptance of a job offer I've ever heard. I haven't accepted yet, Ethan said. This time Hartley did smile, brief, genuine, the kind of smile that lives underneath 40 years of professional neutrality. No, he said. I suppose you haven't. The meeting ended at 9:51. People filtered out. Gordon Marsh shook Ethan's hand and gave him a business card and said, "Call me directly if anything else surfaces. Don't route through the regional office." Ethan pocketed the card and understood that the inspector had just given him something worth having. Marcus Webb stopped beside him on the way out. Webb was a large man, somewhere in his early 60s, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of genuine work rather than conference room performance. "She told me what you did when she dropped that money," he said. "She told me you didn't defend yourself. You just walked past her and put your hands on the helicopter." "It needed fixing," Ethan said. "Yeah," Marcus said. "That's the right answer." He shook Ethan's hand. "Anything you need from my side of the house, you ask me directly. I've been trying to fix this company for a long time. Glad to have another mechanic in the fight." He left. Laura stayed. She sat down in the chair next to where Ethan was still standing, and she put her notebooks on the table in a stack, and she let out a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere she hadn't been able to reach until right now. 2 years, she said. 2 years, he agreed. Every time I filed a report, I thought maybe this time someone would read it and actually do something. And every time it came back, either modified or gone, I would sit at my desk and think about whether I should just quit, whether I was wasting my time. She looked at the stack of notebooks. I filled 7 of these, almost 8. She paused. I kept thinking, what is the point of writing something down if no one ever reads it? Someone read it this morning, he said. An entire board read it this morning, she said, quietly, almost to herself. 7 notebooks. She shook her head slightly. I started keeping them because Marcus told me to. I kept keeping them because I didn't know what else to do. And now she looked at the stack. They're the reason Daniel Cross's entire narrative collapsed in this room. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down. Can I ask you something? Yeah. When you came to Marcus 2 years ago with the original safety concerns and he told you to keep notebooks, what did he say exactly? What were his words? She thought for a moment. He said, Laura, I can't prove what I think is happening and neither can you. But if you write down what you see every day with dates and specifics, eventually the truth accumulates enough weight that it can't be ignored anymore. She paused. He said, the truth is always there. It just needs somewhere to live. Ethan sat with that for a moment. The truth is always there. It just needs somewhere to live. He thought about 11 years in the Air Force, moving from base to base, the accumulated knowledge of thousands of hours with machines that couldn't lie. He thought about Route 9, and the shop with the duct tape on the mirror, and the lease 3 months behind, and the clients who were canceling, and the news van that was probably still parked across the street. He thought about a $50 bill on an epoxy floor and what it was supposed to say about who he was. He thought about Mia on a playground standing up for the version of her father she knew was real. Laura, he said. Yeah. I'm going to take the position. She looked at him. I thought you needed to think about it. I thought about it. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, good. Just that. Then she picked up her stack of notebooks and stood, and the corner of her mouth did something that was almost a smile. Because I already told the FAA inspector you would. He looked at her. Gordon Marsh has been trying to establish an independent safety consultancy partnership with a regional aviation firm for 2 years, she said. He needs someone technically credible, FAA familiar, and not employed by any of the companies he oversees. When I called him Sunday night, I may have mentioned your name in that context. She met his gaze evenly. I kept notebooks for 2 years while people ignored me, Ethan. I know how to plan ahead. He stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed. It was short and genuine, and caught him slightly off guard. The kind of laugh that comes out when the world does something you didn't see coming, but probably should have. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. "Since about 20 minutes after you refused to sign off on the helicopter," she said. "I knew then what kind of person you were." She tucked the notebooks under her arm. "I just needed to make sure everyone else found out." She walked out of this conference room. Ethan sat alone at the long table for a few minutes. The morning light was coming through the windows at an angle now, and the room had the particular quiet of a place that had recently held something significant and was now settling back into its ordinary dimensions. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Hector from the shop. A text that said Brennan referred us to his brother-in-law. "New client. Wants a full inspection on a Beechcraft Bonanza. I told him Thursday. That okay?" Ethan typed back. "Thursday is good. Tell him we'll be thorough." He put his phone in his pocket, stood up, straightened the chair and picked up his toolbox from where he'd set it by the door. He was almost out of the conference room when Vera appeared in the doorway. She was holding something. He couldn't see what it was until she held it out to him, and when he saw it, he understood immediately what it was, not from what it looked like, but from the way she was holding it. The particular careful way a person holds something they've decided means more than its face value. The $50 bill. "I almost threw it away," she said. "That morning after everything happened. Someone found it on the hangar floor and brought it to me, and I almost threw it straight in the trash because it felt like evidence of something I didn't want to be reminded of." She looked at it for a moment. "And then I thought, no. I should be reminded. That's the point." Ethan looked at the bill. He didn't take it. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I know it shouldn't disappear." She looked at him. "I know what I thought you were when you walked in that morning. I know what I communicated with that," she looked at the bill, gesture. "And I know that the gap between what I thought you were and what you actually are is the biggest professional mistake I've made in my career." She paused. "I'd like to not make that mistake again. About anyone." He looked at her for a moment. "You could make it into something," he said. "What do you mean?" "Some kind of reminder. In the company. Not for you personally, for the organization. A reminder that the most important information in a room doesn't always come from the most expensive source." She looked at the bill. Something moved across her face, not an idea exactly, more like the seed of one. "I'll think about that," she said. "Take your time," he said. He shifted the toolbox in his hand. "I need to get back to the shop. I've got a Beechcraft Bonanza coming in Thursday." She nodded. "I'll have my attorney's office draft the consulting agreement today. You'll have it by end of business." He moved past her into the hallway and she let him go, and he walked down 2 flights of stairs and through the lobby and into the parking structure where his truck was still carrying the crack in the bumper and the duct tape on the mirror and the long scratch along the driver's door that Mia had put there 2 summers ago with her bicycle. He got in. He sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, looking at the concrete wall in front of him, and he let himself feel what he hadn't let himself feel for the entire duration of the meeting, the full weight of what this week had cost. The canceled clients, the news van, the voicemail, the math on the kitchen table, the text message from an unknown phone telling him to back off. The way Mia had said, "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" without saying it at all. He let it sit. He breathed. Then he started the truck. He had a shop to run, a Beechcraft to inspect on Thursday, a consulting agreement to review tonight after Mia was in bed, and a phone call to make to Colonel Reyes, who deserved to hear from him directly. He had work, and the work was honest. That had always been enough. That was still enough. He pulled out of the parking structure into the Phoenix morning, and the sun was high and the traffic was moving, and the city was doing what cities do, generating forward motion, whether or not any individual inside it was ready for the next thing. Ethan Walker was ready. He had always been ready. He just hadn't always been seen. The consulting agreement arrived at 6:48 that evening. Ethan was at the kitchen table when his phone lit up with the email notification. Mia's finished homework stacked neatly to his left, and the remains of dinner, grilled chicken rice, the broccoli she'd eaten under formal protest, still on the counter behind him. He opened the document, read it twice, sent 3 requested changes to Vera's attorney's office, and by the time he'd put Mia to bed and read their nightly 2 chapters, the revised version was already back in his inbox with all 3 changes accepted. He signed it at 9:51 p.m. He didn't feel triumphant about it. He felt something quieter than that, the particular settling that comes when a decision you've already made in your bones gets confirmed on paper. He closed the email, put his phone face down on the table, and sat for a while in the kitchen with the lights low the way he sometimes did after Mia was asleep, and the house went quiet enough that he could hear himself think. He thought about where he'd been 1 week ago, 3 months behind on the lease, 2 cars in the shop, 1 employee, a phone that rang mostly with collection calls and occasionally with work. He thought about the morning he'd driven to the Whitmore hangar with his worn toolbox and his old truck and his Air Force uniform, thinking he was going to fix a helicopter and be home by noon. He'd been home by noon, just not the noon he'd planned on. He looked at the invoice on the corner of the table, the same invoice he'd been keeping face down for weeks. He turned it face up, picked up a pen, and wrote the number across the top that the consulting arrangement would cover. Then he sat back and looked at it for a long time. The math worked. For the first time in 3 years, the math worked. He didn't call anyone. He didn't celebrate. He turned off the kitchen light, checked the locks the way he always did, looked in on Mia the way he always did. Her hair spread across the pillow, her breathing steady, her face doing that complete and unguarded peace that sleeping children have. And then he went to bed. He was asleep by 10:30. He slept better than he had in months. The news cycle moved on the way. News cycles do with the speed and fidelity of something that lives in the present tense and has no memory. The Arizona Business Journal updated its original story twice, then published a separate piece on the FBI's involvement in the Arcturus Systems connection. 3 aviation trade publications ran detailed analyses of the maintenance failures that were technically accurate and professionally written, and that without exception used Ethan Walker's name in a context that was the complete opposite of how it had first appeared. The 2 clients who'd canceled came back within 10 days. One of them, the private pilot who'd apologized on the phone about his insurance carrier, called Ethan directly and said, "I want to apologize again. In person this time." He drove to the shop on a Wednesday afternoon and shook Ethan's hand and sat in the waiting area for 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular, the way people sometimes do when they feel they owe a debt they can't fully repay, and the best they can manage is presence. Ethan appreciated it. He didn't say so. He made the man a cup of coffee and asked how the Cessna was handling in crosswind conditions, because that was the real conversation and they both knew it. The Beechcraft Bonanza came in Thursday as planned. Ethan found a cracked fuel line fitting during the inspection, minor, easily fixed, nothing dramatic. But the client, a quiet man named Delgado, who flew charter routes on weekends, stood watching Ethan work and said, "I read about you, what you did at Whitmore." "Most of what you read was probably wrong," Ethan said without looking up from the fitting. "The part I read was the FAA inspector statement," Delgado said. "That part." Ethan looked up. Delgado shrugged. "I fly people," he said. "Strangers mostly. People who trust that the aircraft I'm putting them in has been looked at by someone who actually looks." He paused. "I'd like to bring every plane I fly to you from now on. All 4 of them." Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he went back to the fitting. "I'll clear Thursdays," he said. By the end of the month, the shop's calendar had filled in ways that Ethan hadn't seen since the first year after he opened. Not because of publicity. He never gave another interview, never posted anything on social media, never responded to the 3 different podcast producers who reached out through his shop's email. It was word of mouth, the old, slow, reliable kind. One pilot told another pilot. One maintenance manager mentioned his name to another maintenance manager. The FAA Inspector Gordon Marsh, in the careful and technically deniable way that federal employees sometimes operate, happened to mention in 3 separate professional conversations that Walker Aviation and Repair was doing excellent independent inspection work in the Phoenix area. The phone started ringing differently. Hector came to him on a Friday afternoon when the shop had 3 aircraft and 2 vehicles in for service simultaneously, and said with the particular directness of a man who had been around long enough to say what he meant, "You need another mechanic." "I know," Ethan said. "You going to hire one?" "She working on it." "Work faster," Hector said. "My knees aren't 25 anymore." Ethan hired a young woman named Santos 3 weeks later, 28 years old, former Army aviation mechanic, 2 years out of her military contract, and looking for somewhere to land. She walked into the shop with her own toolbox and a resume that was half blank, because the Air Force doesn't put on paper everything it actually teaches you. And she looked at the shop the way Ethan had learned to read people who understood the value of things that didn't look expensive. She started Monday. By the end of her first week, she and Hector were finishing each other's diagnostic observations the way mechanics do when they speak the same language. Ethan watched this from across the shop and felt something expand in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. It took him a day or two to recognize it as pride. Not personal pride, not the kind that needed to be about him. The quieter kind, the kind that comes from watching something you built start to become bigger than you. Meanwhile, the Whitmore situation was developing at the particular speed of legal processes, which is to say, slowly, thoroughly, and with a great deal of paperwork. The FBI's cyber investigation confirmed within 6 weeks that the anonymous board emails had been prepared and scheduled for delivery from a server in Latvia rented through an Arcturus Systems holding company. The Arizona Attorney General's office filed additional charges against Daniel Cross, including wire fraud and corporate sabotage. 3 executives at Arcturus Systems, including the VP, who had been Daniel's point of contact, were indicted on federal charges. The Arcturus case would take 2 more years to fully resolve. Ethan followed it the way he followed most things steadily without obsession, checking in when there were developments and going back to work when there weren't. He testified once in a federal hearing in downtown Phoenix, and he sat at the witness table in the same manner he did everything directly without performance, answering exactly what was asked and nothing more. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Okonkwo, who had done her homework, asked him at the end of his testimony, "Mr. Walker, when you refused to sign off on the helicopter that morning, knowing it would delay Ms. Whitmore's investor meeting and potentially cost the company a significant deal, what was your reasoning?" Ethan thought about it for a moment. "No amount of money is worth putting people in the air on a machine I'm not certain about," he said. "That's not a policy. That's just how I was taught. By the Air Force, and before that, by my father." He paused. "A machine either is or isn't safe. The business situation around it doesn't change the condition of the machine." Okonkwo looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Walker. No further questions." He drove back to the shop and did an oil change on a Cessna 172. The day the Whitmore Safety Center opened was a Tuesday in late October, 14 months after Ethan had first pulled his truck through the company's gate at 7:40-something in the morning, expecting to fix a helicopter. The center occupied a dedicated section of the Whitmore facility, separate entrance, separate operations, staffed by 3 independent safety inspectors who reported to a board oversight committee that Laura Mitchell chaired. Laura had designed the intake process herself. Every safety report filed through the center received a documented response within 48 hours. Every technician who filed a report was protected from internal retaliation by a board-level policy that Vera had pushed through over the objection of exactly 1 board member, who subsequently did not return for the next term. The center's filing system was physical and digital, simultaneously backed up in 3 separate locations, because Laura had kept notebooks for 2 years, and she knew what happened to digital records when the wrong person had administrative access. Vera had asked Ethan if he wanted to speak at the opening. He said no. She asked if he wanted to be present. He said yes, but quietly. So he stood at the back of the small gathering employees, a few board members. Gordon Marsh, from the FAA, two representatives from the National Business Aviation Association, including Colonel David Reyes, who flew in from Washington, and he listened. Vera spoke for about 10 minutes. She talked about what the center was and what it was for, and what they hoped it would accomplish. She talked about Laura Mitchell and the 2 years of notebooks, without which she said clearly, and without softening it, people would likely have died. She talked about the responsibility companies had to the people who worked for them and the people who flew in their aircraft. And then she said something that made the room go quiet, in the particular way rooms do when someone says the exact truth out loud. "I want to tell you about a morning 14 months ago," she said, "when I dropped a $50 bill at the feet of the person who was about to save this company's future and possibly several people's lives. I did it because he didn't look the way I expected expertise to look. He didn't come in a car I recognized or wear clothes I associated with competence. He was quiet, and he was direct, and he carried a toolbox that had been through more real work than every piece of equipment in my hangar combined." She paused. "And I communicated with that gesture that I had already decided his value before he opened his mouth. That is a mistake I have thought about every single day for 14 months. Not because it was embarrassing, though it was, but because if he had walked out that door, and he had every right to, I would never have known what I almost lost." She reached into the pocket of her blazer. She held up the $50 bill, not a different one. The same one with a small crease in the lower left corner from where it had spent 14 months folded in an inside pocket, or framed on a wall, or carried somewhere close enough to be a constant reminder. "This is going to live in this center," she said. "Not as a trophy, not as a feel-good story, as a question this organization has to keep asking itself." She looked around the room. "Are we listening to the right people? Or are we only listening to the people who look and sound like what we expect wisdom to look and sound like?" She walked to the wall to her left where a simple frame had been mounted. She placed the bill inside it. It was already matted and ready. She'd planned this part. Under the bill, on a small card, 4 words: "Listen before you judge." Ethan in the back of the room looked at the frame for a moment. Then he looked at the floor. Reyes materialized beside him so quietly that Ethan didn't notice until the man was already there, standing shoulder to shoulder with him, watching the room. "You did good, Walker," Reyes said. "You gave them my number," Ethan said. "I gave them the best mechanic I've ever worked with," Reyes said, which is the same thing. They stood together for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who had been through things together and didn't need to narrate them. "How's the shop?" Reyes asked. "Good," Ethan said. "Real good, actually. Heard you hired. 2 people. Might need a 3rd by spring." Reyes made a quiet sound of satisfaction. "And Mia?" Ethan looked sideways at him. Reyes had met Mia exactly twice, once at a base function 6 years ago, when she was 3 once at a 4th of July gathering at Ramos's house 2 summers back. The fact that he asked about her by name was the kind of thing Ethan filed away without commenting on. "She wants to be an aerospace engineer," Ethan said. Reyes raised an eyebrow. "Since when?" "Since about 3 weeks after all this happened." Ethan almost smiled. "She asked me to explain how the tail rotor drive shaft worked, so I explained it. Then she asked me to explain lift and drag. Then she asked me to explain how jet engines work. Then she went to the library and got 4 books. He paused. "She's 9. She's your daughter," Reyes said simply. After the ceremony, after the small crowd dispersed into coffee and conversations, Laura found him near the door getting ready to leave. She had her new notebook under her arm, the 8th one barely started, the pages still mostly empty and waiting. "How does it feel?" she asked. "What? All of this?" She gestured vaguely at the room, at the framed $50 bill, at the whole accumulated weight of the past 14 months. He thought about the question honestly. "Weird," he said. "In a good way. Like the machine is running right. You can feel it when it's wrong, and you can feel it when it's right. Right now, it feels right. She smiled at that. That's the most mechanic answer possible. I'm a mechanic, he said. You're more than that. I'm a mechanic, he said again, and his voice wasn't defensive, just settled. That's not a smaller thing. That's the whole thing. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. Yeah, she said. I know. He drove back to the shop. Santos was finishing a compression test on a Piper Cherokee when he walked in, and Hector was on the phone with a parts supplier, and the shop smelled like it always smelled, honest, worked in real. His toolbox was on the bench where he'd left it that morning, the same battered steel chest with his name scratched into the lid by Sergeant Kowalski at Bagram in 2009. He put on his work jacket and picked up the next job order from the board. A Robinson R-44 helicopter routine, 100-hour inspection. Owner's name was Park. No urgency, no crisis, no investors, no board meetings. Just a machine that needed looking at by someone who knew what they were looking for. He picked up his flashlight. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Mia texting from her after-school program. She'd learned to text with a precision and efficiency that suggested she'd absorbed more from watching him communicate than he'd realized. The message said, "Can we have scrambled eggs for dinner? With the cheese." He typed back, "Always with the cheese." She sent back a single emoji, the kind with the big smile. He put his phone in his pocket and walked to the Robinson. He put his hand flat against the fuselage and stood still for a moment the way he always did, listening before he looked. Reading the machine the way you read something you respect, with attention, without assumption, with the understanding that it would tell you the truth if you were patient enough to hear it. And here is where the story arrives at what it has always been about. Not the $50 bill, though that matters. Not the sabotage or the courtroom or the framed reminder on a wall, though those matter too. It is about this, a man with worn tools and honest hands, standing in his own shop on an ordinary afternoon, with his name on the deed, and his daughter's text in his pocket, and a helicopter that needed looking at. He had not become something different. He had become more completely what he always was, a man who showed up, who looked at the machine and told the truth about what he saw, who refused to sign his name to something he couldn't stand behind regardless of the price, who taught his daughter, without ever sitting her down and delivering a speech about it, that doing the right thing is not a transaction. It doesn't guarantee that people will immediately believe you or reward you or even be kind to you. It just guarantees that you get to keep being the person who did it. Ethan Walker had spent most of his life being underestimated by clients who chose the bigger firm, by a CEO who dropped money at his feet, by a chief engineer who thought he was the easiest possible person to frame because nobody would look twice at a small shop mechanic from Route 9, by a world that mistook quietness for weakness and worn tools for limited capability. He had never argued with any of it. He had just kept working, and the work had told the truth the way work always does in the end, if it's done honestly and long enough. 3 months after the safety center opened, Vera called him on a Saturday morning. Not about work, there was nothing urgent. No crisis, the company was running cleanly under the new oversight structure, and the quarterly review wasn't for another 6 weeks. She called because she'd been thinking about something, and she wanted to say it directly. "I've been wondering something," she said. "Go ahead," he said. He was in the shop working on a Saturday because he liked working on Saturdays when it was just him and the machines, and the quiet. "When I dropped that money at your feet," she said, "and you picked up your toolbox and walked past me, what were you actually thinking in that moment?" He considered the question. He gave it the respect it deserved, which was a few seconds of actual thought rather than a reflexive answer. "I was thinking that the helicopter needed fixing," he said, "and that you'd get out of my way eventually because you needed it fixed more than you needed to win that particular moment." A silence on the line. "That's all. That and," he paused, the honest addition, "I was thinking about whether I'd have enough to cover the rent this month, because I'd driven 40 minutes to get there, and I needed the work." She laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded. "I figured it was something like that," she said. "I've been building you up in my head as this figure, This person who was too principled to even register the insult. I registered it, he said. I just had a helicopter to fix. That's better, she said. That's actually better than the version I'd been telling myself. He listened to her for another minute, and then he said, Vera. Yeah. You've called me 4 times in the last month about things that weren't work-related. A pause. I know. You're doing it because you feel like you owe me something. A longer pause. Maybe. You don't, he said. The debt went both ways. You gave me the consulting work when I needed it. You went on record when it would have been easier not to. You gave Laura a position with actual authority. He let that settle. We're even. You can call me when something breaks. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what if I want to call to say things are going well? He almost smiled. Then call Laura. She'll appreciate it more. She kept 7 notebooks waiting for someone to say that. Vera laughed again. Fair enough, she said. Fair enough. He hung up and went back to work. The months that followed were not dramatic. They were full, in the way that a well-run engine is full, every component doing exactly what it was designed to do. No excess friction, no wasted movement. The shop grew carefully the way Ethan did everything without rushing anything that needed time. Santos turned out to be extraordinary, the kind of technician who asked questions, not because she didn't know things, but because she understood that the person who stopped asking questions was the person who started missing things. He gave her more responsibility by the end of her 3rd month than he'd given anyone in 3 years. Mia turned 10 in November. He took her to the Air Museum in Tucson for her birthday, her choice, and she moved through the exhibit halls with the focused intensity of someone doing research rather than recreation, stopping at every placard asking questions that the docents occasionally had to look up the answers to. She stood in front of a retired Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopter for a long time without saying anything. That's a Huey, Ethan said. Vietnam era. I know, she said. We read about it. She was quiet for another moment. Did you work on these in the Air Force? Not this model, the updated versions. Is it true the tail rotor is the most important part? He looked at her sideways. She was looking at the aircraft with the expression she got when she was figuring something out, building it in her head. Who told you that? I read it, in one of the books from the library. What did the book say? It said the tail rotor is what keeps the whole thing from spinning out of control. That the main rotor generates torque, and the tail rotor counters it, and if the tail rotor fails, you lose everything. He watched her looking at the aircraft. That's right, he said. So the most important part is the one that counters what would otherwise be chaos, she said. He didn't answer immediately. He stood beside his 10-year-old daughter in a museum in Tucson and looked at a retired helicopter and felt something move through him that wasn't quite a feeling and wasn't quite a thought, something in between, the kind of thing that only happens when a moment is exactly what it's supposed to be. Yeah, he said. That's one way to put it. She nodded, satisfied, filed it away, and moved on to the next exhibit. He followed her. A year after the Safety Center opened, Laura Mitchell was invited to speak at the National Business Aviation Association's annual conference in Washington. She spoke for 32 minutes about safety reporting culture, about the institutional pressures that discourage technicians and inspectors from filing accurate reports, about the difference between a system that is designed to catch problems and a system that is designed to look like it catches problems. She brought her notebooks, all 8 of them by then, and placed them on the lectern in a stack while she spoke, not as props, not for drama, just as the physical reality of 2 years of documented truth waiting for someone to read it. The speech was recorded and posted on the NBAA's member portal. Within 3 weeks, it had been shared enough times that it made it outside the aviation industry entirely. Ethan didn't watch it until Reyes sent him the link with a one-line message. "This is because of you. Thought you should see it." He watched it alone at the kitchen table on a Sunday night after Mia was in bed. He watched Laura stand at a lectern in front of 400 aviation professionals and say clearly and without qualification that the most important thing a safety culture could do was make it safe to tell the truth. He watched her describe the afternoon an independent mechanic walked into a hangar and listened to a helicopter for 45 seconds and heard what 8 engineers had missed. She didn't use his name. She didn't need to. The people in that room who needed to understand what she was saying understood it. When the video ended, Ethan sat at the table for a while. Then he got up, checked the locks, looked in on Mia, and went to bed. In the morning, he drove to the shop, put on his work jacket, picked up his flashlight, and looked at the first job on the board. A Cessna 182. 100-hour inspection. Owner's name was Rivera. He walked to the aircraft. He put his hand on the fuselage. He listened. And the machine, as machines always do when someone is paying real attention, began to tell him the truth. That was what Ethan Walker was. Not a hero of anyone's story, not a symbol, not a lesson that corporations hired consultants to package into leadership retreats. He was a man who showed up, who told the truth about what he saw, who raised his daughter to understand that integrity is not the absence of cost, it is the willingness to pay the cost without turning it into a performance. The shop on Route 9 was his. The tools were worn and honest. The work was real. The lease was paid. The cheese was always in the eggs. And every morning, without fail, without fanfare, without anyone watching, Ethan Walker opened his shop and put his hands on the machines that people trusted with their lives, and he made sure those machines deserved that trust. That was the whole story. That was always the whole story. Some men are measured by what they demand the world see in them. Ethan Walker was measured by what he did when nobody was looking, and the weight of that when it finally came to light turned out to be more than any room he'd ever stood in was prepared to hold.